4,000 years ago, inside a pyramid at Saqqara, priests stood over the body of a dead king and offered him a bowl of onions. Not bread, not gold, not wine, onions. And they didn't call them onions, they called them something else entirely, something that connects a child's first lost tooth to the god Horus, to the sky, and to the very idea of coming back from the dead. To understand why, we have to ask a question almost nobody asks. What happened to a baby tooth in ancient Egypt? The mystery today: losing a first tooth is small and sweet. A tooth under a pillow, a coin left behind, a tiny ritual almost every culture on Earth has invented in its own way. But rewind 5,000 years to the banks of the Nile, and the question gets strange fast. The Egyptians left behind some of the most detailed records of any ancient civilization: medical papyri describing surgery, court cases, love poems, tax records. And yet a simple question like, what did a mother do with her toddler's tooth, is almost impossible to answer directly. So why does this question matter? Because the Egyptians didn't think about the body the way we do. To them, teeth weren't just tools for chewing. They were tied to speech, to eating in the afterlife, to identity itself. If you lost your ability to open your mouth, ancient Egyptians believed, you lost your ability to live again after death. That single belief is the thread that leads us somewhere nobody expects, not to a nursery, but to a tomb. Background. To get there, we need one piece of context. The Egyptians believed death was not an ending. It was a doorway. But a body in a coffin couldn't just walk through that doorway on its own. It had to be reactivated, given back its senses piece by piece, like switching a body back on. That reactivation had a name: the opening of the mouth ceremony. It was performed on statues, on mummies, on the dead king himself, and it looked nothing like a quiet funeral. A priest called the sem-priest would dress in the spotted skin of a leopard and stand before the body, holding a strange curved tool with a forked blade shaped like a fish's tail. This tool was called the peseshkef. Here is what makes the peseshkef so revealing. Egyptologists have found that this exact instrument was originally a birth tool, used by midwives to cut a newborn baby's umbilical cord. The Egyptians then took that same object, the one that separates a newborn from its mother and starts its first breath of life, and used it again, decades later, on a corpse. They touched it to the mummy's mouth and eyes as if performing a second birth. A priest, with an adze, a tool shaped like a small axe, would tap the face gently, restoring sight and speech one sense at a time. The foreleg of a freshly slaughtered calf was lifted to the lips, incense curled through the tomb. Spells were read aloud, word for word, exactly as they had been recited for kings before. The goal of all of this was simple and enormous at the same time: to give the dead the ability to breathe, to see, to speak, and to eat again in the next world. Death, to the Egyptians, was not the opposite of birth. It was a repeat of it. And buried inside that ceremony's oldest surviving script is a line about teeth, not just any teeth. The teeth of Horus. Main story: around 2350 BCE, inside the pyramid of King Unas at Saqqara, workers carved the oldest religious writings ever found on Earth, the pyramid texts. These weren't public prayers meant for crowds. They were private instructions, sealed inside stone corridors no living person was meant to read again, meant only to guide the king through the journey into eternity. One line of that inscription reads almost like a stage direction in a script. The priest says over the body of the dead king, "Take the white teeth of Horus, which equip your mouth," and right beside those words, carved into the tomb wall, is a picture of the exact offering that went with them: a bowl holding 5 onion heads. That's the first problem the audience runs into. Why teeth? And why, of all things, onions? The answer sits inside Egyptian mythology, in one of the oldest and most violent family dramas in the ancient world. Horus was the falcon-headed sky god, son of Isis and the murdered king Osiris. When Osiris was killed by his own brother Set, young Horus grew up fighting to reclaim his father's throne. The two gods clashed for years. In the most famous version of the myth, Set tore out one of Horus's eyes during the struggle. That wounded, healed eye later became the Eye of Horus, a symbol of protection and healing still tattooed on people today, thousands of years after the myth was first told. Far less famous is a second legend, quieter but just as strange, about Horus's teeth. According to Egyptian myth, when Horus was still a child, his own milk teeth loosened and fell out the way every child's do. But where they touched the earth, the story says, something new grew from the ground. Onions. This wasn't treated as a cute fairy tale by the Egyptians, it was treated as evidence. Look at an onion closely, the layered white flesh underneath, the sharp green shoots breaking upward through the soil, and it genuinely looks like a small row of teeth pushing through gums. To Egyptian eyes, trained to read the natural world as a message system from the gods, that resemblance wasn't a coincidence. It was proof, sitting right there in a vegetable garden, that a god's fallen baby tooth could return to the world as something alive. So when priests placed a bowl of onions, or, in some copies of the same inscription, 5 cloves of garlic, beside the body of a dead king, they weren't improvising. They were reenacting Horus's own childhood myth on the body of the deceased. The unspoken logic was almost like a spell. Just as Horus's fallen tooth became a new living thing bursting from the soil, may this king's mouth be restored. May he speak again. May he eat again. May he be born a second time, exactly as Horus once was reborn from tragedy into kingship. A problem. The dead cannot eat, speak, or return to life on their own, led to a decision by Egyptian priests. Borrow the childhood story of a god's baby tooth and physically reenact it over a corpse. That decision had a consequence no one intended when the myth was first told. A lost tooth stopped being a small, forgettable moment of childhood. It became one of the most loaded symbols in Egyptian religion, living proof, according to their belief system, that something broken off the human body could still generate new life elsewhere. Researchers studying these funerary texts have also noted something else buried in the same passage. The offering wasn't just teeth in a vague sense. Later religious commentary connects the phrase to 5 specific types of milk teeth: incisors, canines, and molars, treated almost like a checklist, a full symbolic set being restored to the dead all at once, as if the ritual wasn't just giving the king a mouth again, but giving him back an entire, complete, childlike set of teeth to start over with. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. If baby teeth were tied to something this powerful in royal funerary religion, you would expect ordinary Egyptian families to have had their own version of this ritual too, something equivalent to a modern tooth fairy, a custom for an ordinary child's first lost tooth at home, far from any pyramid. Archaeologists and historians have searched for exactly that. And the honest answer is, we don't have one. No papyrus describing a mother burying her son's tooth in the garden, no tomb painting of a child throwing a baby tooth toward the sun, the way some other ancient cultures reportedly did. If everyday Egyptian families had a tooth ritual for their own children, it either hasn't survived 4,000 years of sand, flooding, looting, and decay, or it simply wasn't considered important enough for scribes to write down in the first place, since so much of what survives from Egypt was written for kings, priests, and the dead, not for ordinary households. That gap is not a failure of the story. It's the story. The twist. Here is what changes everything. In ancient Egypt, the first tooth mattered most, not at the beginning of a life, but at the very end of one. The Horus tooth myth wasn't a bedtime story for toddlers, it was resurrection technology for kings. The loss of a baby tooth, something every human experiences once, briefly, and then forgets, was borrowed by Egyptian religion and turned into a working proof of concept for the biggest promise their entire civilization ever made, that death is not final and the body can be started up again. Even more remarkable, this wasn't a one-time poetic flourish carved for a single pharaoh and then abandoned. Researchers cataloging funerary texts have found the same teeth and onion offering appearing again and again across different tombs and different centuries, from the Old Kingdom of Unas through later dynasties of Egyptian history. Almost every time it's tied to the same formula lifted straight from Horus's myth. That kind of repetition matters. It tells us this wasn't a poet's flourish that got carved once and forgotten in the rock. It was a fixed part of the script, said the same way, generation after generation, because the Egyptians believed the exact wording, repeated exactly, was what made the magic work. And the Paseshkef ties directly back into this same twist. Remember, this was the same forked blade used to cut a newborn's umbilical cord, the tool of a baby's very first moment outside the womb. Egyptologists studying its use in funerary art have pointed out that its name in the Egyptian language roughly translates to something like splitter of the ka being a person's life force. In other words, the very same object that separates a newborn from its mother in the delivery room was reused, without embarrassment, as a tool for prying open a dead man's mouth thousands of years later. Birth and death used the identical instrument, because to the Egyptian mind they were, in a very real sense, the identical event. This reveals something Egyptologists find genuinely fascinating about how the Egyptians thought. They didn't separate biology from mythology the way modern science does. A tooth falling out of a child's mouth and a new plant pushing up through soil weren't two unrelated events happening to be described with similar words. To them, they were the same underlying pattern, appearing twice in nature, proof that the world itself kept whispering the same message the priests were reciting over the dead, that loss, if handled correctly, could become renewal. The answer. So, what did ancient Egyptians actually do with the first tooth? For ordinary families, the honest answer is that we simply don't know. No surviving record describes a mother burying her child's tooth, or a ritual marking that small private milestone at home. That silence is real, and a good documentary doesn't paper over it. But for Egyptian religion as a whole, the religion that shaped tombs, temples, and the beliefs of an entire civilization for 3,000 years, the first tooth became something far bigger than a family keepsake. It became mythology, and then it became ritual. Egyptians told a story that the falcon god Horus, as a child, lost his own baby teeth, and that those fallen teeth transformed into onions growing from the earth. Centuries later, priests reenacted that exact myth at the funerals of their kings, standing over the mummified body dressed in leopard skin, holding a blade once used to cut a newborn's umbilical cord, offering onions or garlic as the symbolic white teeth of Horus, so that the dead, like a child taking its first breath, could eat, speak, and live again. A child's most ordinary, forgettable moment, one tiny tooth wiggling loose and falling out, was picked up by an entire civilization and rewritten into their explanation for how death itself could be undone. Ending, which leaves us with a strange kind of respect for the ancient Egyptians. They didn't need a tooth fairy, a coin under a pillow, or a story to soften a strange little moment of childhood. They had something bigger and stranger, a genuine belief that the human body, even in its smallest and most disposable pieces, held the pattern for eternal life, and that if you understood the pattern correctly and repeated the right words over the right offering, you could use it to bring a king back from the dead. Think about that the next time you see a bowl of onions on a kitchen counter. To us, it's dinner. To the priests of Saqqara, 4,500 years ago, it was a resurrection in progress. But that raises another mystery entirely. If a fallen tooth could symbolize rebirth, what did the Egyptians believe happened to hair, to nails, to blood, the other small pieces of the body they left behind every single day? The answer, as it turns out, is just as strange.